good evening, everyone. I think we'll get started just a little after 7. Welcome to the continuation of the 2019 Menno Simons Lecture Series. My name is Rachel Epp Weaver, and it's my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker. Alain Epp Weaver graduated from Bethel College in 1991 with degrees in Bible and Religion, English, German, and philosophy. 4 degrees in 4 years, during which time he also spent a year studying at the Philipps-Universität in Marburg, Germany. In the time since he graduated from Bethel, Alain has spent many of his years working with Mennonite Central Committee, the subject of his lectures, in a wide variety of capacities. He first served as a teacher in the town of Zababde in the occupied West Bank. He went on to serve as project coordinator for MCC in the Gaza Strip, then as country representative for MCC Palestine, then as regional representative for MCC Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq, and most recently working stateside for MCC in administrative roles of program development and strategic planning. In between these various terms, with MCC, Alain twice returned to school at the University of Chicago, earning a master's in divinity in 1999 and a PhD in theology in 2012. His presentation to us this evening is entitled First to the Household of Faith, MCC, Humanitarianism, and the Church. Please help me in welcoming our speaker and my big brother, Alain Epp Weaver.
So, good evening. In his letter to the Galatian church, the Apostle Paul exhorts his readers to not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. As we therefore have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. Paul calls Christ's followers to live lives conformed to and shaped by God's Spirit, lives marked by doing good for all, with an emphasis on doing good to those within what Paul names the household of faith. This phrase, especially unto them who are of the household of faith, sometimes shortened to first to the household of faith, surfaces repeatedly during Mennonite Central Committee's first decades in MCC's description of its mandate. The creation of MCC in the early 1920s to respond to famine in Russia did not emerge from a generalized humanitarian impulse, but rather from an appeal from Glaubensgenossen, or relatives in the faith, an appeal from Mennonites in Russia for assistance as they faced acute hunger. For some of the Mennonite groups that came together to form MCC, the Glaubensgenossen who appealed for assistance were not only relatives in the faith, but also near and distant blood relatives, or Blutgenossen. MCC's next major initiatives in the 1930s and during World War II, and during and after World War II, also responded to needs within the Mennonite household of faith. First in the late 20s and early 30s, with MCC arranging for and assisting in the settlement of Mennonite refugees from the Soviet Union to the Paraguayan Chaco. And second, the World War II collaboration with Quakers, the Church of the Brethren, and other groups in lobbying for creating and administering the civilian public service program that allowed Amish, Brethren in Christ, Mennonite Brethren, and other conscientious objectors to undertake work of national importance as an alternative to military service. One way to narrate MCC's first decades then would be to describe MCC as focused on providing assistance within the household of faith, or as a booklet published by MCC on the occasion of its 25th anniversary in 1945 put it, the bringing of relief to stricken members of the Mennonite body. Yet such a recounting of MCC's early decades would be incomplete. Narrating MCC's first years as narrowly focused on the needs of the Glaubensgenossen would fail to account for how, in the 1920s famine response in Russia, MCC reached many more non-Mennonites than Mennonites, nor would an account of the civilian public service program as primarily about the need to create alternatives to military service for Mennonite young men adequately capture how CPS pushed Mennonites to care about doing good for all beyond the Mennonite Church, with the experience of CPSers in places like Gulfport, Mississippi, and in assignments within mental hospitals, sowing the seeds of future Mennonite involvement in efforts for racial justice, and in the establishment of mental health care facilities that sought to provide more humane treatment. What began as doing good to those within the church expanded into broader efforts to do good. While references within MCC reports, memos, and external news releases to the Galatians 6:10 passage taper off beginning in the 1950s, the tension encapsulated within Paul's admonition to do good for all, especially to those of the household of faith, a tension between the particular and the universal, between doing good to all and doing good to those to whom one is close, one's family, one's friends, one's fellow church members, has persisted across MCC's history. So, for example, when responding to mass displacement that began in the summer of 2016 within the Kasai region of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, should MCC focus its humanitarian assistance exclusively or primarily on the thousands of Mennonites displaced from Kasai? Or should its response be determined solely by criteria of need? And what is the role of partnership with Congolese Mennonite churches in such a response? These questions are emblematic of what I would describe as a persistent tension, not just for MCC, but for Christian relief agencies more broadly, between a theologically grounded mission of working with, through, and for the church on the one hand, and a commitment to humanitarian principles such as impartiality, proportionality, and neutrality on the other. Tension, to be sure, is not the same as fundamental incompatibility or irreconcilable conflict. It does, however, reflect that MCC has sought from its inception to hold together two values that can at times sit uncomfortably with one another, namely the humanitarian principle of impartial assistance based solely on need, and the value of providing mutual aid within the church. This lecture probes how MCC has attempted in its history to hold these potentially conflicting commitments in tension with one another. I'll begin by providing a brief overview of the development of modern humanitarianism and of the values embedded within contemporary humanitarian standards to which MCC and other church-based relief agencies adhere, noting the suspicions that some humanitarian actors have of religiously rooted actors engaged in emergency response to basic human needs. I will then turn to a discussion of how MCC leaders describe the organization's relief efforts during its first quarter century, examining how they viewed doing good to all and doing good for fellow Mennonites as fundamentally compatible. I next look at correspondence from Mennonite relief workers in post-World War II Europe that shows them both fending off accusations of sectarian focus and objecting to what they viewed as the overly narrow focus of other Christian aid actors in assisting members of their own churches. After the 1950s, MCC references to responding to the household of faith begin to disappear, surfacing only occasionally as the organization's commitment to the principle of impartiality in the distribution of humanitarian assistance becomes increasingly embedded within the organization. Yet, as I suggest in the concluding section of this lecture, the decline starting in the 1950s of MCC citations of Paul's admonition to do good first to the household of faith does not mean that the tension between humanitarian principles and the commitment to working with, through, and for the church disappears. Indeed, I will argue that this enduring tension stems in part from the fact that MCC has played two main functions since its inception, not only working to meet basic human needs in the name of Christ, but also functioning as an ecumenical engine that by bringing people together and churches of divergent faith communities together has forged ever-shifting and often expanding understandings of who belongs within the household of faith. The modern humanitarian movement begins with the founding of the International Committee of the Red Cross, or ICRC, in 1863. The Swiss businessman Henri Dunant deeply disturbed by the suffering he witnessed in the aftermath of the 1859 Battle of Solferino in Italy, became a leading proponent of the principle that emergency assistance to the wounded and needy should be offered without discrimination. Together with a group of prominent citizens of Geneva, Switzerland, Dunant founded the ICRC to promote a vision of humanitarian action during times of war guided by principles of non-discrimination and impartiality and of an international order that enshrined such humanitarian principles. This humanitarian movement, born in Switzerland, grew rapidly with the founding of, over the ensuing decades, of scores of national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. The burgeoning Red Cross movement mobilized during World War I to care for prisoners of war and to provide relief assistance to civilian populations besieged by the horrors of war. For its efforts during the war, the ICRC received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1917. 2 years later, in 1919, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies established a set of fundamental principles that have defined modern humanitarianism over the past century. One of these foundational humanitarian principles embraced by the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement was impartiality, or non-discrimination, in the provision of humanitarian assistance. When providing aid, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement stressed humanitarian actors must make no discrimination as to nationality, race, religious beliefs, class, or political opinions, but must rather be guided solely by the needs of suffering individuals, giving priority to the most urgent cases of distress. Humanitarian actors must help people regardless of their religious beliefs, the color of their skin, their political convictions, where they come from, or whether they are rich or poor, ensuring that those in the greatest need receive assistance first, and making distribution decisions on a needs-only basis that is not influenced by personal considerations or feelings. More recent efforts by today's humanitarian actors, from United Nations agencies to donor governments, to international non-governmental organizations like MCC, to articulate basic humanitarian principles, have returned again and again to the foundational standards first expressed by the Red Cross, Red Crescent. So, for example, the SPHERE standards, first developed in 1997 as a multi-agency effort to improve the consistency and quality of humanitarian aid, stipulate that humanitarian assistance must be provided according to the principle of impartiality, which requires that it be provided solely on the basis of need and in proportion to need. This reflects the wider principle of non-discrimination, that no one should be discriminated against on any grounds of status, including age, gender, race, color, ethnicity, sexual orientation, language, religion, disability, health status, political or other opinion, and national or social origin. The core humanitarian standard of 2014, another multi-agency initiative that emerged in part from the SPHERE project, and which laid out 9 commitments for humanitarian agencies to use in measuring and assessing the quality of their actions, underscores that humanitarian agencies must design and implement appropriate programs based on an impartial assessment of needs and risks, and commit to providing impartial assistance based on the needs and capacities of communities and peoples affected by crisis. In its efforts to provide food, basic hygiene items, shelter, and other forms of humanitarian aid to individuals and communities devastated by war, earthquakes, hurricanes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and more, MCC, along with other Christian relief agencies like World Vision or Catholic Relief Services, seeks to adhere to the principles and commitments developed by SPHERE and the core humanitarian standard, including the principle of the impartial provision of humanitarian assistance on the basis of need alone, without regard to the religious identity of recipients. Some humanitarian actors, however, express skepticism about the commitment of faith-based organizations like MCC to humanitarian principles. So, for example, a study commissioned in 2014 by Lutheran World Relief of senior development professionals working for USAID and international NGOs regarding their perceptions of faith-based organizations found ambivalent attitudes. On the one hand, respondents generally affirmed faith-based organizations as a positive force in international humanitarian efforts, thanks to their connectedness to local networks and their responsiveness to beneficiaries. At the same time, however, respondents voiced concerns about faith-based humanitarian actors potentially tying their assistance to the religious identification of recipients or to proselytizing activities. Such critics worry that Christian, Muslim, and other religious humanitarian organizations may compromise humanitarian principles such as impartiality by directing their assistance first to their respective households of faith. During MCC's first 2 decades or so, its leaders saw minimal tension between the humanitarian principle of impartiality on the one hand and commitment to first responding to those within the household of faith on the other. In the early 1940s, prior to the US entry into the Second World War, MCC Chairman Oriel Miller wrote in a letter to MCC representative in Germany, MC Lehman, that our work, as you know, is entirely nonpartisan. Relief to be extended without preference as to race, nationality, or otherwise, with particular attention to relief needs among war-suffering women and children. Miller continued, in case, of course, that there should be relief needs among the Mennonite folks of Europe, these should also receive prior consideration. For Miller, being entirely nonpartisan and giving prior consideration to the Mennonite folks of Europe were perfectly congruent. MCC came into being as a response to a call for help within the household of faith through the decision of diverse Mennonite churches to collaborate in a joint response to the plea for Mennonites in Russia for food assistance in the face of famine. The booklet published by MCC on the occasion of its silver anniversary in 1945 presented the decision to create MCC as a channel for collaborative action as a decision that spontaneously grew out of the desire of the Mennonite Brotherhood to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and to testify by loving service to the God of peace and love. And not just any hungry people, but specifically hungry Mennonites. There was no wavering in the mind of the brethren who decided to take the step. The Brotherhood in Russia was stricken with famine. It was the Christian duty and privilege of the churches in America to bring assistance. In a retrospective summary in 1929 of this first MCC initiative, MCC leaders P.C. Hebert and Ori Miller described MCC's famine response that ran from 1920 to 1925 in Soviet Russia as a response to the sufferings of our brethren and as a common great work of mercy to them of the household of faith and others. The "and others" at the end of this sentence might read as an afterthought. Hebert and Miller recognized that the readers whom they sought to reach with their book-length summary on the book-length summary report on the famine relief effort were primarily interested in how MCC had assisted their Glaubensgenossen and Blutgenossen. Yet Hebert and Miller's reference to "and others" also functions as a recognition that the Pauline call to do good to them of the household of faith is paired with a more universal call to do good to all people. Miller and Hebert's report presented MCC's famine response not only as an answer to the appeal from Mennonites in Russia, but also as emerging from the desire of Mennonites in the US and Canada to live out the Mennonite doctrine of non-resistance in an active, not simply negative, manner. Noting that there, quote, was little satisfaction in just maintaining a negative position toward war, Hebert and Miller described Mennonites in the US and Canada as seeking opportunities to disprove the charges of cowardice and selfishness made against the conscientious objectors, and to express in a positive, concrete way the principles of peace and goodwill in which they believed. The call for help from Russia offered the chance to express Mennonite peace convictions in a positive way. The need there was great, little was being done, and there was the added incentive of being able to help and work with and through those of our own household of faith. MCC's famine relief response in Russia in the early 1920s can, from one perspective, be viewed as a new variation on a longer history of mutual aid within and between Anabaptist groups, a history that can be traced back to the Dutch Mennonite Fonds voor Buitenlandse Noden, or Fund for Foreign Needs, established in the 17th century to provide assistance to persecuted Mennonites in other parts of Europe. Writing in the 1940s, Mennonite sociologist and one-time professor at Bethel College, J. Winfield Fretz, described MCC as a glorious demonstration of mutual aid in a new day, a collaborative venture that is much more complex than a barn raising or husking, but nevertheless a number of people working together to achieve a common goal, with the goal here being to feed our brothers across the sea. Mutual aid within church communities, such as the barn raisings of Old Order Amish, depend on cultivated habits of sharing within the household of faith, while the mutual aid described by Fretz at play in MCC's 1920s famine relief response expanded understandings of who belongs within the Mennonite household of faith. Mutual aid within an expanding Mennonite household of faith in turn prepared Mennonites for sharing with a broader circle, with aid within the household of faith serving as training and preparation for, in Paul's words, doing good to all people. The 1920s famine response did have a focus on Mennonite communities in Russia, but it also worked with those Mennonite communities in extending relief assistance to non-Mennonites. To be sure, one factor behind this broader assistance was that Russian officials made such broader assistance a precondition for MCC's operations in the country. So, for example, MCC's agreements with Soviet officials do not speak of MCC providing assistance to Mennonites, but rather of MCC rendering aid to the famine sufferers in Soviet Russia. Similarly, an MCC letter to Herbert Hoover, the head of the American Relief Administration, the organization through which MCC aid was sent into Soviet Russia, presented MCC's relief program as a response to the call of Russia for assistance, with MCC's program receiving and forwarding funds and materials for war sufferers in South Russia. In keeping with pledges to the Russian government, aid was given without discrimination for race or creed, John Unruh observed in his 1952 History of MCC. Unruh proceeded to acknowledge, however, that the efforts were designed to help especially the suffering brethren of the faith, and feeding operations were carried out in locations where Mennonites predominated. If, as the 1945 MCC Silver Anniversary booklet stated, a major purpose of the MCC relates to the desires of the American Brotherhood to serve in behalf of fellow Mennonites both at home and abroad, it was also the case, the booklet continued, that in a much larger way, MCC reaches out to all men everywhere, especially during times of national or world crisis, such as wars. P.C. Hebert echoed this assessment in his foreword to the 1945 edition of the MCC Handbook, observing that since its foundation in July 1920, that was his date, not my date, MCC had not only found many opportunities to employ its good offices in the interest of our people, but had extended its field of activity considerably beyond the initial purpose of distributing food to those of the household of faith in famine-stricken Russia. MCC had a dual responsibility, explained MCC board chairman and Brethren in Christ leader C.N. Hostetter at the MCC annual meeting in 1944. A responsibility both to those within and to those without. Within the worldwide fellowship of our Mennonite Brotherhood, our duty seems clear to minister to the relief of human suffering, noted Hostetter. Yet, he stressed, our responsibility does not stop with those within the Mennonite Brotherhood. As disciples of Christ, we must concern ourselves about human suffering, wherever it is within the range of our possibility to help. True disciples of Christ must always remain sensitive and stand ready to minister and serve. Or in the Pauline language of Galatians, Mennonites might be called especially to do good to the household of faith, yet doing good should not stop at the boundaries of that household, but rather expand out to all people. In the years following the end of the Second World War, MCC embarked on what remains the largest response in its history. sending container after container of relief supplies for distribution among displaced persons and war-torn communities in post-war Europe. Within a year after the signing of the European armistice, MCC commissioned C.F. Clausen to investigate needs in Europe, with a focus on the needs of the Mennonite Brotherhood, which was greatly affected by the war. Clausen highlighted the presence of displaced Mennonites from Russia in internment camps, which moved MCC to bring aid to these stricken brethren. The MCC response to the devastation of post-war Europe thus began with Mennonite co-religionists. In response to an October 1946 letter from First Lieutenant Roy Eluhow of the U.S. Armed Services, asking what could be done to assist displaced persons in post-war Germany from Russia, Latvia, Poland, and Ukraine, MCC Administrator William Snyder responded candidly that, though we are interested in the plight of all unfortunate persons, we feel a particular responsibility to those of our number who belong to the same household of faith. However, while MCC in its post-war Europe response did undeniably have a particular focus on responding to the needs of European Mennonite communities, sorry, I think I'm ahead a slide, MCC also sought, in the spirit of the Galatians passage, to do good to all people. An MCC administrator in 1945 observed that passions to proactively reach out beyond themselves to show Christian love in action through humanitarian relief had been kindled among Mennonites in the US and Canada during the war years, writing that the great and extensive need moved upon the hearts of our people, and there is an increasing awareness of the excellent opportunity peace churches have to give a witness to Christian love through relief activities. Where possible, MCC sought to work in coordination with and through European Mennonite churches, even as much MCC relief assistance was distributed through other channels. MCC relief worker Robert Kreider, based in Berlin, underscored in a July 1947 report on meeting Mennonite needs in Germany that our concern is that no cause of critical need among our people goes unmet. Citing the Galatians passage about doing good, especially unto those of the household of faith, Kreider explained that with the help of organized committees of the Mennonites themselves, the MCC is seeking to help the needy among our brethren. Kreider conceded that providing this assistance to Mennonites in the different zones of occupied Germany has not been an easy task. First, because Mennonites were scattered among the different zones, and second, because the number of MCC workers who are authorized to do relief and refugee work among the refugees is very few, which meant that the burden of work falls to the Mennonites themselves in determining how to allocate relief aid. Kreider stressed that being Mennonite, simply being Mennonite, did not qualify a person for relief assistance. Acute aid was an essential criterion as well. Our aim with the Mennonite relief committees is to seek out those Mennonites who have acute need and aid them, Kreider explained. Because a person has the label Mennonite does not automatically entitle him to MCC relief aid. The Mennonite relief representatives work under the guiding principle that they must verify need before aid is given. MCC also worked with the different European Mennonite relief committees to not only look inward to the needs of Mennonite communities, but also to reach out beyond themselves. Some European Mennonite relief committees moved in this direction. For instance, Kreider reported that a Mennonite relief committee in the French zone of occupied Germany, led by Abram Braun and Emil Hendiges, had as its first concern ministering to Mennonite need, but also noted that their service extends to others in need who live in the vicinity of Mennonite congregations. Yet Kreider also noted challenges in working with church groups that looked inward rather than outward. In a January 1947 letter to MCC Administrator in Akron, J.N. Byler, Kreider objected to what he termed the limited relief spirit of North American Baptists with whom MCC was partnering in relief efforts. Their exclusive concerns with the needs of their particular household of faith represented a narrow sectarian relief philosophy that does not represent the full breadth of the spirit of Christian service, Kreider contended. Kreider and his colleagues sought to counter what they sometimes viewed as a similarly sectarian relief approach among German Mennonites, insisting that a program which is exclusively concerned with the household of faith does that household a disservice. If we pumped all our supplies into the pantries of Mennonites, they would love it, Kreider observed. But the Mennonites would come out of the war despised by their neighbors, selfish, and a pretty dim Christian witness. Our strategy to get the German Mennonites to organize themselves to help their needy cases, and also to help others in need, is a more ennobling experience for them. In Kreider's letter to Byler describing the dynamics at play between MCC and German Mennonites in making decisions about relief aid allocations, one sees a pattern that has repeated itself time and again over the past 70 years in MCC relief initiatives. MCC's church partners, both Anabaptist and non-Anabaptist, pressed for more relief aid to go to help those within the household of faith, even if they don't use the Galatians language. MCC in turn pushes back to insist both on need as the fundamental criterion for who will receive relief assistance, and on the importance of the church reaching out beyond itself. And in these instances, MCC navigates the challenging rhetorical terrain of rightly insisting on upholding humanitarian principles in relief aid distribution, while avoiding the danger of spiritual condescension potentially embedded in MCC, in Kreider's words, determining what will be a more ennobling experience for its church partners, a danger heightened by the power imbalance of a relatively resource-rich MCC and its church partners. Even as it sought to counter what is sometimes viewed as a sectarian spirit among European Mennonites and other Christian groups, MCC also occasionally faced criticism from other Christian organizations of being overly focused on providing assistance to Mennonites. In May 1946, Ms. W.M. Barent, in her capacity as Secretary of the Interchurch Reconstruction Committee of the Netherlands, wrote to Peter Dick, serving as MCC Director of Holland Relief, with complaints about MCC's failure to direct its relief aid through the interchurch mechanism, and about what Barent viewed as MCC's overly narrow focus on providing humanitarian assistance to Mennonites. Dick responded defensively, asserting that your accusation of our being sectarian in our distribution here and distributing only to our household of faith, the Mennonites, is entirely unfounded and unjust, and pointing to MCC's items of accepted policy, which stipulated that the intent and influence of MCC relief program be to relieve need regardless of the recipient's race, class, or political sympathies. Granting that MCC had direct contact with our Mennonite churches here and that we often distribute from Mennonite church buildings, Dick emphasized that statistics prove that much more is given to non-Mennonites than Mennonites. Dick arguably overstated his case when he went on to insist that in our entire relief program, it is our intent and purpose to find out not the Mennonites, but those people of all classes and all religions and with no religion who are in greatest need. Clearly, MCC's post-war relief efforts in Europe did not use need as the sole criterion for assistance, but did also have a special concern for those of the Mennonite household of faith. Yet Dick rightly noted that MCC cooperated with the Red Cross and with municipal welfare authorities in the Netherlands in identifying aid recipients, with needs serving as the basic criterion for those decisions. MCC's post-World War II response in Europe began with a shift within MCC discourse away from a limited focus in relief efforts on fellow Mennonites. For Wilhelmina Keif of the MCC China Relief Unit, this meant developing a broader understanding of who belonged to the household of faith. Writing to MCC administrators William Snyder and J.N. Byler in 1947, Keif called for Mennonite aid funds to be directed to meet emergency needs in China. Appealing to the Galatians passage, Keif argued for an expanded understanding of who qualified as belonging to the household of faith. Keif wrote, "As we think of the varied provision that has been made to help out Mennonite youth in the United States and their refusal to become part of the military machine, and other measures made to help refugee groups in our Mennonite fellowship, we realize that these Chinese are also our brothers and sisters in the household of faith. By the 1960s and 70s, MCC leaders increasingly talked about an expanded vision of care and outreach as part of Mennonites, on the part of Mennonites in the US and Canada. MCC Executive Secretary William Snyder, in Reflections on Christian Social Service, penned in 1963, admitted that at times we were criticized for being too much concerned about our own people and not enough with the rest of the world, with MCC witness restricted primarily to the brotherhood. While Snyder insisted that there was always a concern for the welfare of the neighbor, he granted that this concern for doing good to all people had expanded over the past couple of decades. Our people's vision increased as the modes of communication improved, as they grew more prosperous, and as they became more aware of human need on the national and international level. Now we are ministering to the needs of people of almost every race and creed, and we are known around the world for our ministry of compassion. 9 years later, in 1972, Canadian Brethren in Christ leader E.J. Swalm traced a similar trajectory of expanded vision. Although MCC workers of an earlier generation were mindful of doing good to all people, Swalm observed that they religiously specialized on the household of faith. He continued that in our generation we are indebted to several factors that have not only aroused our brotherliness, but have broadened our vision. They are the two global wars, modern communication, and speed of travel. The world has shrunk so much geographically, Swalm concluded, that tragedy is close to us no matter where it occurs, in turn helping Mennonites in the US and Canada to come to a broader understanding of membership within the household of faith. The Pauline qualification to do good, especially to those of the household of faith, now functioned in a less restrictive manner. MCC vision and policy statements from the 1970s onwards embraced the humanitarian principle of impartiality. So, for example, the MCC statement on program assumptions, objectives, and priorities from 1976 highlighted that our involvements throughout the world are rooted in faithfulness to Christ, who calls us to love and share with those in need, regardless of race, creed, or political persuasion. The 1985 edition of the Internal MCC Handbook, meanwhile, stressed that MCC believes that help should be given without regard for religious or political persuasion, granting that MCC has felt a special sense of responsibility to aid fellow Christians, members of the household of faith who may be stricken with calamity and suffering. The handbook proceeded to insist that need is the first and sole criterion of aid. MCC services are made available without regard to race, creed, nationality, or social status of the recipients. In a 1989 compilation of the unwritten tenets of MCC operations, MCC leader Reg Taves underscored that MCC was responsive to the needs of everybody, not sectarian or just for Mennonites. And in its 1994 statement, A Commitment to Christ's Way of Peace, MCC declared that our love and ministry reach out to all, regardless of race, religion, or status, whether friend or foe. The appeal to the Galatians passage, with its emphasis on especially doing good to the household of faith, markedly receded within MCC discourse from the 1960s onwards, with the emphasis shifting more towards a clear embrace of the humanitarian principle of impartiality. Yet amidst this shift, the tension between a call or an expectation to respond to needs within the church on the one hand, and the principle of basing humanitarian response on need alone on the other, has persisted. An example from Nicaragua in the mid-1980s illustrates this enduring tension. In a memo entitled, "What Should We Do?" MCC Administrator Rich Sider asked for counsel about how to navigate MCC's relationships with the Nicaraguan Mennonite and Brethren in Christ churches. Sider observed that these churches held an understanding of service that is primarily concerned with helping church members, something that created tension between the churches and MCC. In response to food needs within Nicaragua, MCC had decided to channel food aid through the Evangelical Committee for Aid and Development, or CEPAD, a Protestant ecumenical organization. We wanted the food to be distributed through churches to the most needy displaced persons all over the country, Sider explained. And CEPAD is the only organization with the capacity to do that, so we sent the food to them. While the Nicaraguan Mennonite and Brethren in Christ conferences belonged to CEPAD, they criticized MCC's decision to send aid through that channel. Sider reported, "The Mennonite churches say everyone in Nicaragua is suffering and that they have particularly needy people within their churches. But if they don't happen to be in areas where CEPAD is distributing, none of the food is available to them. They can't understand why we give so much to CEPAD and none directly to them. Besides, they say CEPAD takes all the credit and doesn't mention that Mennonites have provided the resources so they don't even get any PR out of it. What should we do? How does the scriptural principle of first the household of faith apply here?" Sider asked. "What is more important, the family or the overall needs?" While the Galatians 6 passage has rarely been quoted within MCC over the past 3 decades, Sider's question about what takes precedence, the family or the overall needs, the particular or the universal, doing good to the household of faith or doing good to all, has persisted up until the present. In distributing humanitarian aid through the Syrian Orthodox Church as it cares for displaced peoples in Syria's civil war, through the Church of the Brethren in Nigeria as it ministers to communities facing attacks by the Islamist Boko Haram group, or via Congolese Mennonite churches as they assist families uprooted by fighting in Congo's Kasai province, MCC continues to struggle with this tension of working with, through, and for the church, and working solely based on the criterion of need. As we've seen so far, doing good, especially to those within the church, generates tensions, not necessarily irreconcilable tensions, but tensions nevertheless, with the humanitarian principle of impartiality. In the concluding part of this lecture, I will shift focus to another dimension of MCC's work with the church, namely how MCC has worked over the past century to build up and foster an expanded understanding of who belongs to the household of faith. The very name Mennonite Central Committee already implies some type of ecumenical collaboration, a bounded set for which MCC operates as the center, or at least the center for the particular purpose of cooperative action by diverse Mennonite churches in feeding hungry people. To be sure, MCC has never operated as a Soviet-style central committee with top-down centralized authority, and the boundaries of the set of churches that claim MCC as their agency have been porous and shifting throughout MCC's history. MCC as an ecumenical inter-Mennonite collaboration was at its inception a tentative one, a cooperative venture that has gained stability over time, but which has been and continues to be marked by different types of mutual suspicion and friction among Mennonite churches. Henry Fast, an administrator of civilian public service camps for MCC during World War II and one-time pastor at Bethel College Mennonite Church, captured one variation of these tensions as he reflected on the CPS program. "Our inter-Mennonite rivalries were, of course, a major problem in administering the CPS program," he wrote. "We were so jealous lest some group get an advantage. We had to make sure that we got proper representation and leadership as camp directors, business managers, cooks, and education directors, who would visit the camps as ministers, and to whom would they minister? And when ministers would offer communion, would it only be to members of their own groups, or would others be allowed to participate? We all had our stereotypes of one another. You mention someone who is Mennonite Brethren and you have one kind of image. And if you were from the General Conference, that stirs other feelings. They were a little bit afraid of GCs at the time because the stereotype said that GCs were worldly, activists, and liberal-minded. We had to be very sensitive to the conservative groups. Yet even as divides of doctrine and practice have marked MCC from its beginnings, collaboration and service has fostered new forms of unity. Writing about MCC's relief distributions in Soviet Union in the early 1920s, MCC historian John Unruh reflected that beyond thousands being fed, clothed, and saved from starvation, there came from the initiative a new sense of brotherhood on the part of those who administered the aid, a feeling of oneness and common purpose that reached beyond the differences. Similarly, he continued, the CPS Alternative Service Program brought the various Mennonite and affiliated groups into a cooperative relationship such had never been attained before. True, the period of tremendous stress had its influence in this, but it was amazing how generally successful the whole program operated. The Mennonite Church in America, more than ever before, became aware of its strength. Through the civilian public service and PAX programs in the 40s and 50s, MCC actively sought to foster common theological convictions, particularly around the doctrine of non-resistance and the gospel of peace. The MCC Peace section published multiple booklets on military conscription aimed at shoring up Mennonite refusal of military service and at articulating a vision of non-resistance as active witness to God's peace. MCC also developed a curriculum for use in CPS camps of 6 booklets on Mennonite history, identity, peace theology, by Mennonite historians and theologians like Harold S. Bender, C. Henry Smith, E.G. Kaufman, and Guy F. Hirschberger, and organized regular peace conferences for Paxmen in post-war Europe. Through such publishing and educational ventures, MCC not only brought people from theologically diverse Mennonite churches together in an ecumenism of practical collaboration and service, but also worked to nurture a shared identity and theological outlook. MCC's Peace section worked over the ensuing decades to nurture peace theology and the church's commitment to a gospel of peace. MCC also at times pushed Mennonite churches on matters of theological ethics, challenging Mennonite churches to develop more robust peace theologies that went beyond the refusal of military service to also address racism, sexism, unjust economic systems, the human devastation of the natural environment, and the dispossession of indigenous peoples, even as MCC also sometimes faced criticism from other Mennonites for being insufficiently bold in tackling justice issues. MCC from its beginnings has also been a story of global Mennonite collaboration, not just collaboration among different Mennonite churches in the US and Canada. MCC started as a response to call from Mennonites in Russia, with much of the staffing of MCC-operated soup kitchens and feeding centers in the early 1920s coming from these communities. Following World War II, MCC partnered with European Mennonite churches in post-war relief and reconstruction. And this partnership with Anabaptist churches has continued over subsequent decades to the present, from Zimbabwe to Congo to Ethiopia, from India to Vietnam to South Korea, and from Bolivia to Colombia to Honduras. In his 1952 history of MCC, John Unruh stressed that this inter-Mennonite international cooperation has been encouraged not as an end in itself, but rather as mutually beneficial and as an asset in certain efforts calling for concerted rather than individual action. Yet one could argue that nurturing an expanded understanding of the Anabaptist Mennonite faith has not simply been a byproduct of MCC's relief, development, and peace-building efforts, but has at times been an end in itself. MCC's leadership in building and maintaining connections with Mennonite communities behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War, MCC's intertwined history with and extensive support for Mennonite World Conference, MCC's infrastructure of program offices around the world, which provide an in-country point of contact for Mennonite churches in those countries with the broader Mennonite world, even after North American mission agencies have scaled back or withdrawn their personnel. In these and other ways, MCC has worked to provide what MCC Executive Secretary William Snyder in 1961 called a strong inter-Mennonite lift to Anabaptist Mennonite churches around the world. An integral part of MCC's mission in the name of Christ has thus been to nurture and expand common understanding of what it means to belong to the Anabaptist Mennonite household of faith, be it through bringing different Anabaptist churches together in service to collaborate on practical relief, development, and peace-building projects, through helping forge connections among various Mennonite churches, and through advancing inter-Anabaptist peace theology as it responded to specific situations of violent conflict and injustice. A whole other lecture, meanwhile, could be devoted to how over the decades, MCC's broader than Anabaptist ecumenical partnerships have shaped, challenged, and expanded Mennonite understandings of who belongs to the household of faith. From collaboration with the Church of the Brethren and the Quakers in the establishment of CPS camps, to support for ecumenical initiatives in Transkei and apartheid-era South Africa and in post-colonial contexts in East Africa, to programming through Coptic Orthodox and Coptic Evangelical churches in Egypt over the past 40 years, to initiatives with Catholic communities and organizations working for justice within contexts of revolutionary change in Central America in the 1980s, to partnerships with Baptist and Pentecostal churches in humanitarian response in Ukraine today. And another lecture after that could address how MCC's relief, development, and peace building engagements in interreligious contexts over the past 60 years have also raised questions for some MCCers about the scope and shape of the household of faith. From operating programs in countries like Bangladesh, Laos, and Vietnam with primarily non-Christian staff, from Muslim to Buddhist to Hindu and more, to collaboration with Islamic charitable societies in villages in rural Jordan, to the placement of students in universities behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War, and in Iran in the late 1990s and in the early part of this century. Through these ecumenical and interreligious engagements, MCC's encountered a wide variety of non-Christians, heeding in their own distinctive ways Paul's call to do good to all people. And these engagements have in turn raised questions for MCC workers about how the Mennonite and Christian households of faith in turn relate to other households of faith. And such questions point us back to the more basic question of what MCC's missiology is, what its understanding is of what it means to participate in God's reconciling mission in the world. And we'll take up such missiological questions in tomorrow evening's concluding lecture. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for questions.
Thanks, Alan, for a very stimulating lecture. I have first an observation and then a question. The first observation is this issue of the household of faith. I was interested in that you had have the data from what government aid workers, I think is the way you said it, saw faith-based organizations. My observation is that I've had the opportunity to work with quite a few USAID programs around the world. They have their own version of this. So that, you know, it's the first time I ran into this was being part of a group of development and humanitarian agency heads where we were addressed by Colin Powell after the 9/11 event, and he started his address by saying, we see aid workers as partners in our fight against terrorism.
Force multipliers.
Right, force multipliers. And so but you know, you talk to people, for example, in Bangladesh, and you know, they will say you have to leave your SPEAR standards at the door when you walk into the aid office, because essentially aid is politicized in terms of what priorities are for the government, U.S. government. There's certain places in the world where you, as we know, is conditional on what it is. So there is this sense of household for aid workers in the secular setting as well. So there's a version of that. My question is, you've used the word humanitarian aid in arguably the first 25 years of MCC's history, which is your first part of your lecture, that was essentially what MCC was a humanitarian organization.
Right.
MCC also does development, peace work.
Sure.
I'm wondering if the same principles that you've laid out would apply there, or have you've chosen to use the word humanitarian aid throughout your lecture? Is that an intentional choice, or is it sort of intended to include other parts of sort of development and peace building, that sort of thing, or is there a different standard which applies when you move out of the humanitarian aid sector, meaning giving immediate relief around disasters and that sort of thing?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I focused in on humanitarian assistance primarily to frame the conversation in terms of comparison between MCC and humanitarian assistance versus, say, like an ideal type, of which the Red Cross is often taken as this ideal type of an apolitical organization that's focused on providing aid impartially, solely on the criterion of need. But it also, the principle of who are the people with whom we work and that we want to benefit from MCC projects, MCC supported initiatives, would I think also apply to development and peace building initiatives. I mean, especially development initiatives, whether it's like a food security project, conservation agriculture project, some type of health or education project. Is it solely for Mennonite, Anabaptist, or Christian students or farmers, etc.? Peace building, I think maybe, I mean, you could, and there are peace building projects that are solely within church bodies, because Lord knows there's plenty of conflict within churches. But a lot of peace building work also then involves conflicts within the broader community, which involves not just Mennonites, but others in the community, whether they're other Christians or Christians and people of other faiths. So maybe peace building efforts by their nature tend to push out already beyond the church.
This is to follow up with, hi, I'm way back here. To follow up with maybe on, was that Ron who just spoke? Is that you over there, Ron? Hi. With his comments, and I'm just kind of curious, for a college student who is about to graduate and considering how they wish to live out their Mennonite identity and especially the ways they've been shaped to live a life of service. And they're considering whether to serve with Mennonite Central Committee or a similar faith-based organization, or a non-religious or non-sectarian organization, maybe the World Health Organization or something like that, for the specific reason of trying to avoid all this messy religious stuff. If you could put on your non-dispassionate MCC hat for a moment, how would you respond to that kind of a question if you were trying to entice somebody to come and serve with MCC?
Well, I mean, partly, that's a very good question, thank you. Partly I'd begin by pointing to what I think Ron was gesturing at in his comment, namely that while, yes, there is a messiness to working with the church, it's not like there's not a messiness to working with USAID or the United Nations or supposedly secular non-governmental organizations. There's plenty of messiness to go around. It's just what type of messiness are you committed to? I'll presume for the sake of argument that the person, the imagined university student, college student that you're referring to, has some type of Christian commitment, is wanting to be faithful in discipleship in whatever context, vocational context they find themselves in, whether that's in a church context or a different context. And so the pitch I would make to them is that in working for the church, you get to be deeply, in working for MCC, you get to be deeply immersed in the messiness of God at work in the world, of how God's grace is with the church even when it is at its most flawed, that God redeems not just our individual selves, but is working to reconcile a peoplehood together to God. And it's often hard to see that, in congregations here in the U.S., in the church globally, but we have a faith that the gates of hell will not stand against the church. And by working for an organization like MCC or working for a Mennonite Mission Agency, you get to be deeply embedded within that messiness, that we have a deep faith that God is working to redeem and to reconcile back to God. That would be my pitch. I didn't know I'd be called upon to give a sermon.
Alan, we'll just stick with the same corner over here.
Sure.
I was intrigued by some of your comments about how MCC kind of worked at expanding the household of faith, particularly with Mennonite World Conference. But if I was following everything, some of your comments about that were pretty historical.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I'm curious, and maybe you're going to talk more about this tomorrow when I happen to be teaching and can't be at the lecture.
I won't hold that against you.
Okay. But I'm curious about how you would talk about the current relationship between MCC and Mennonite World Conference around the world, and what some of the challenges and growing edges are there. Is that a fair question?
Yeah, it's a very fair question. I'd say that it's a very strong relationship. I mean, especially at it's sort of tricky to say central level of MCC, but at the level of like the Executive Secretary of Mennonite World Conference, Cesar Garcia, has very strong and warm relationships with the executive directors of MCC Canada and MCC US. MCC is a strong financial contributor to Mennonite World Conference as well. And MCC also operates this Young Anabaptist Mennonite Exchange Network, or YAMN, on behalf of Mennonite World Conference, where young Anabaptists from around the world go from one part of the Global South to another part of the Global South to serve and exchange fellowship and gifts with one another. So a young person from Indonesia potentially going to serve in Zimbabwe, or someone from Zimbabwe going to serve in El Salvador with the church. So those are some essential ways where MCC is working together with Mennonite World Conference. MCC provides significant support to the Global Anabaptist Service Network, which brings together MCC from the US and Canada, but also different Mennonite service agencies, whether they're from Europe, Africa, Asia, or Latin America. So there's a strong commitment to working there. Then when we get to the individual country level, the picture, as one might suspect and wouldn't be surprising, the strength of the relationship between MCC and churches in the countries can vary quite significantly from country to country, with strong relationships in some, and relationships of distance and tension in others. MCC is committed in all of the countries where we work to engage Mennonite churches. That doesn't necessarily mean providing financial assistance or material aid or seconding personnel to the church in the country, but commitment to engagement. Where possible, there's a commitment to having representatives from the church or churches sit on advisory committees that provide counsel to MCC country programs. And in some of those instances too, especially in some of our Latin American programs, church leaders help to select or approve the appointment of MCC representatives, or are involved in performance appraisals for MCC representatives. So both at the global central level as well as on the country level, continues to be a strong commitment. It's not a thing of the past. Which makes, in some ways, I mean, I don't want to say the word unique, because then someone will come up with an example from a different Christian context, a different Christian organization that is like this, but I don't think a lot of, well, World Vision certainly doesn't, and I think a lot of other Christian humanitarian relief, development, peace building agencies don't play this additional function of nurturing an Lutheran or inter-Catholic or inter-Baptist function that MCC plays in its work around the world. Which makes, being an MCC representative both an engaging as well as challenging job, because you're trying to, on the one hand, administer a professional relief and development and peace building program, and then you also have this ecumenical task.
Right.
Over there, a couple of.
In recent years, how has the relationship with MCC and the U.S. government changed, especially regarding countries that MCC is in and that the U.S. is at war with?
Yeah, so a flippant answer would be that probably for the most part, the U.S. government doesn't pay much attention to MCC. That would be the case. MCC, there's one narrative within MCC, a pretty strong narrative, that MCC, for example, has never received U.S. government assistance. That's an incomplete narrative historically. The U.S. government provided assistance for the construction of the Trans-Chaco Highway in Paraguay. MCC channeled a lot of USDA surplus food products into the mid-1960s to different parts of the world. MCC currently receives a small grant from the U.S. government to help underwrite shipment of material resources to different parts of the world. But we're not in the same position of like a Catholic Relief Services or World Vision that rely and depend on substantial U.S. government grants for our operations, which provides us with a certain amount of flexibility and also doesn't bring us into some of the challenges of reporting to and reporting on and restrictions that come with government grants. Yeah, I don't know if that gets to your question or not. Of course, MCC is operating in many parts of the world that have been adversely affected, would be a relatively mild way to put it, by U.S. foreign policy, whether that's economic, trade policy, whether that's war or support for violent groups within their countries. So there's certainly been, MCC and its partners have been adversely affected in that way, but not so much in terms, then another way that MCC is adversely affected by U.S. government policy is, both in the U.S., it's not just the U.S. and Canada, we face increasing challenges in getting visas for whether it's visiting MCC partners coming to the U.S. or Canada, whether that's for participants coming from the Global South to be part of our International Volunteer Exchange Program, that 11-month program where people from the Global South come to the U.S. and Canada. So increased restrictions on visas is a challenge. MCC program in the U.S. Seeks to respond to the needs of new immigrants, of asylum seekers, and of course that is a situation that has increased in severity under the current presidential regime, but it's not a new thing either, predates that. So how to work with churches here in the United States at the task of responding to, being faithful in response to the call to welcome strangers, to provide assistance regardless of people's nationalities, immigration status, etc.
I have a reaction to your presentation, especially this evening. As I listened, you've described an imperfect organization and administration that nonetheless accomplished a lot of very, very positive things. And I'm at this point in my life, I have a tremendous sense of gratitude to the people in the organization who struggled to be faithful and did things even though we were not perfect, and neither was the organization.
Right.
I'm a bit overwhelmed with that sense of gratitude, especially this evening. Secondly, and you addressed this partly in response to the question over in the far left rear, can the service-mindedness of our Mennonite history and heritage be reconceptualized in a way that is relevant in today's world, today's needs, and given the current culture of our church? And then one other real small question by comparison, for the sake of disclosure, I hang out a fair amount with Mennonite Disaster Service.
Mhm.
It used to be a part of,
Yeah.
of MCC. What did, the separation occurred somewhere in the 90s. There's a controversy about when exactly that happened.
Right.
But what was the effect of that separation on MCC?
So I'll start with that second question because I think it's a little easier than the other one. Yeah, so I think that I was serving overseas at the time when that sort of official separation, which I think had been a ways in the making prior to the official administrative separation in 1994. So I can't speak to what the immediate impact was there, but what I can speak to is now, and it's my sense, certainly since I've been working in Akron since 2009, that there's a very strong collaborative, complementary relationship between MCC and MDS. There's a partnership agreement between the two so that when, say, there's a earthquake in Haiti, MDS gets people responding to them saying, hey, we want to give money to that earthquake in Haiti. And if they send money to MDS, MDS sends it to us. Similarly, if there's a hurricane that happens in Florida or South Carolina, and people are sending MCC money, which sometimes happens, the agreement we have is we pass on the information there and we put up things on our websites directing people to, if you're concerned about this thing happening here, because MDS, for those of you who don't know, Mennonite Disaster Service, which, as you said, has its origins within MCC. The understanding is MDS responds to disasters in the United States and Canada, and MCC responds to disasters outside of the United States and Canada. There are times when MCC also does respond here in the U.S., but when that happens, we do so in consultation and collaboration with MDS. So whatever the initial impact was in 1994, the current reality, certainly over the last decade, and it's my sense longer than that, has been a strong collaborative relationship, which is helped by the fact that Kevin King, who's the executive director for Mennonite Disaster Service, worked for many years with MCC and an assignment in Bolivia as director of our Food Disaster Material Resource Department. So there's a strong collaboration. To the question of how to renew passions for Anabaptist service in a new age, that is a huge question. I would welcome, this is a cop-out, I know, but I would welcome counsel from people in this room too about how do we engage young people, older people, people of all ages in the passions for service, whether that's service locally in meat canning, in packing relief buckets, in volunteering at thrift shops, or volunteering at relief sales. I'm sure that, I know from reading and from hearing through the grapevine within MCC that that's often a point of active discussion, say within the various relief sale committees, which are all independently operated, of, okay, how do we engage younger generations in being part of carrying out these relief sales, or how do we engage people to become part of MCC through global service, like through the SALT program or through multi-year service assignments. These are active questions. I don't think there are easy answers to them. I'm clearly not giving you a clear answer to it. We welcome counsel.
Alan, I just had a follow-up to Jim's question about U.S. government impact. What's the latest on that you know about in terms of MCC's ability to work with recipients who the U.S. government has labeled as terrorists?
Well, I mean, you know, there are U.S. and Canadian laws about
Yeah.
provision of, it's not just the U.S., also the Canadian government has laws about providing assistance to groups that are deemed terrorists by the U.S. and Canadian governments. So that's just a reality that we have to navigate and can sometimes become a gray area. So, I mean, that's a short answer to your question. Longer answer to your question is that, I mean, there are also contexts in which MCC works where we have to get special licenses, whether it's shipping canned meat and other humanitarian assistance to North Korea, for some work in Syria, things like that.
What about West Bank?
West Bank, the West Bank itself is not an issue. The Gaza Strip, there, you know, we wouldn't. It would be, I mean, it would be problematic to work with any organization that would be affiliated with Hamas, and because Hamas is in control of the Gaza Strip, there would be some, not the U.S. government officials themselves, but because there are U.S.-based organizations that carry out relief and development projects in the Gaza Strip. But there would be some who would try to paint any work in the Gaza Strip as working with Hamas.
Just to keep it contemporary, are there MCC operations that are impacted by the Turkish invasion of the Kurdish part of Syria currently?
The short answer is not really. MCC historically, before the civil war in Syria, had some work in that part of Syria, like teaching English on like short-term basis, like in summer programs in Al-Hasiqa, which is a predominantly a Syrian Christian city in Syria, but is part of, surrounded in the Kurdish part of Syria. And MCC's current work since the civil war in Syria has been more in like the Damascus up through to Aleppo part of Syria. So we have, and there some MCC humanitarian assistance that goes through the Syrian Orthodox Church has gotten to distributed through the church, through the Syrian Orthodox Church in Al-Hasiqa, through relief committees, though that's typically been cash transfers, so not MCC humanitarian assistance itself, but rather cash allowances. Just as an aside, that's a really big thing right now, whether it's by government donors or international NGOs, really pushing cash as an important modality of humanitarian assistance because it gives people flexibility to respond to whatever are the pressing needs they have that month, as opposed to, say, a food parcel, which, yes, is very welcomed and needed, but is basically either serves as food or maybe be sold for cash, whereas cash has more fungibility. But apart from that, it's and so we do have church partners in that area, but but a little bit of a distance from the immediate border area.
What is the process for Haiti, where we learned that a few MCCers came home due to violence there?
Yeah, there's been ongoing protests in Haiti against the government by because of what the protesters view, and I don't think wrongly probably, as corruption on the part of the government. Protests that have brought the country to a standstill in many respects. And so the decision was made after several weeks of this ongoing that non-Haitian personnel would exit the country. They are regrouping in Nicaragua, where they will be working from there as a group. Our Haitian staff continues to live and work in Haiti under challenging circumstances. Please keep them in your prayers during this time. A lot of uncertainty. I was there in February. I was part of every 5 years we do external reviews led by an external reviewer and then with internal people joining the review team. So there was a review of our Haiti program that was happening this past February. I arrived there and we had our first 3 days, went off without a hitch, and then all of a sudden protests broke out in the country, and we were just basically staying at the MCC office for the next 7 days, unable to leave the MCC office, so we ended up doing a lot of the interviews by phone, which we could have done from the United States, presumably. But that provided a small glimpse. That protest only lasted for about a week or 10 days, but then this one has gone on for several weeks now, and what we're hearing is that protesters are saying they're in it for the long haul until the current president steps down. So we pray for a swift resolution that will bring peace to the country.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. We will be here again at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. And thank you again to Alan.